Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today, we're adumbrating the second half of Chapter 11, the triumphs and travails of the Jeffersonian Republic, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Abe, take it away.
All right, so overall, the Louisiana Purchase expanded the power and influence of the federal government. The more immediate effects, however, was it engendered fears of foreign schemes and secession. Aaron Burr was Jefferson's first-term vice president, but after he was fired, he joined with some Federalist extremists and plotted the secession of New York and New England. After Hamilton exposed Burr's seditious scheme, Burr killed Hamilton in a duel. Essentially, Burr murdered the last remaining hope for effective leadership of the Federalist Party. Later, Burr allied with James Wilkinson, the Louisiana military governor, in another secessionist scheme to separate the western part of the U.S. from the east. Burr was arrested for treason, but Chief Justice Marshall, recall him from Marbury v. Madison, declared that proof of overt treason was necessary for indictment. Burr's story ends there. He fled to Europe, but his insurrectionary tendencies proved that the U.S. would have to work to govern its new territories effectively. Now, Frank, could you tell me, what was the neutrality that Jefferson maintained?
Well, in 1804, Jefferson ran for re-election and won by a landslide. However, Napoleon had re-entered into war with Great Britain. This caused a crisis within the American economy and export industry, as in 1806, the British Orders in Council closed ports under French control to all international trade unless the ships stopped in England first. This included America. So, Napoleon created similar legislation in regards to ships bound for British ports. This meant that America had less and less options to trade with if they wanted to steer a course between England and France. The tactic of impressment, or forcing American sailors into the British Navy, was especially despised. This British bullying was highlighted in the Chesapeake affair, when, in 1807, a Royal British battleship confronted the USS Chesapeake about 10 miles off the coast of Virginia and demanded that the Chesapeake turn over 4 alleged deserters from the British Navy. The Americans refused, and the British opened fire, killing 3 and wounding 18. Yet still, Jefferson maintained peace. So, Abe, can you elaborate on the American response to the British and French economic acts?
Yeah, so America felt dishonored by the British and French mistreatment. But Jefferson realized that all the warring European nations depended on the U.S. for foodstuffs and raw materials. So he passed the Embargo Act in 1807, forbidding all exports, with the goal of starving Britain and France into more favorable foreign affairs. However, the effects of the Embargo Act were disastrous. Bustling harbors in the Americas became deserted ghost towns, and overall the act probably hurt the Americans more than the British and French did combined. So there were some momentous effects of the Embargo Act. 1, a large system of illegal trade developed, especially along the Canadian border. 2, with the act passed under Jefferson, many began to oppose him, and therefore the Federalists surged in popularity. So Congress repealed the embargo and passed the Non-Intercourse Act as a substitute. Thus, trade was reopened with all nations excluding Britain and France, the 2 most important, unfortunately. There were several reasons for the failure of the Embargo Act. 1, Jefferson underestimated the determination of the British. He thought that they would quickly agree to stop raiding American ships and to discontinue the policy of impressment. 2, Jefferson overestimated the British and French reliance on American goods. Each had other sources of raw materials and foodstuffs, such as in Latin America. And 3, Jefferson miscalculated the Embargo Act's unpopularity and how difficult it would be to enforce them. There was an underlying positive effect of the Embargo Act, however. With importations scarce, the Americans were forced to begin manufacturing their own goods. The foundations of America's industrialism were laid during the embargo time. So, Frank, who was elected president after Jefferson, and what new policies did he introduce?
James Madison became president in 1809, replacing Jefferson. And in 1810, Congress created Macon's Bill No. 2, which promised that America would restore trade to France and England as soon as either country dropped their trade restrictions. So, therefore, in 1810, Napoleon, leader of France, announced that French commercial restrictions had been lifted, and Madison allowed U.S. trade with France. However, what Madison didn't realize is that Napoleon would go on to continue with its illiberal trade rules now that it had the American trade. So it basically just double-crossed America and got American trade while continuing its normal trade blockades with the rest of the world. So Abe, we've heard about conflicts that America was having with England and with France, but were they also having conflicts with the Native Americans at this time?
Yes, they were. In the last recent elections, many of the older, more submissive men had been swept away and replaced by warhawks, young hotheads from the South and the West. These warhawks refused to accept the British orders in council and policies of impressment lying down. Furthermore, the Warhawks wanted to eliminate the Indian threat for the pioneer Western settlers. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, led the Shawnee tribe and, while forming an Indian confederacy, they urged their supporters to never cede land to the whites without all the Indian tribes' approval in that confederacy. Since the Americans were convinced that the British were supporting the Indians, they sent William Henry Harrison to advance on Tecumseh's headquarters. Tenskwatawa attacked Harrison in the Battle of Tippecanoe, but Harrison eventually drove the Shawnees back. So Harrison was made a national hero after the Battle of Tippecanoe, and Tecumseh formed an alliance with the British and therefore fought fiercely on their side in the War of 1812. So Frank, could you tell me, what further set the stage for the War of 1812?
Well, America declared war on England during the War of 1812 for a couple key reasons. The first was obviously British impressment of sailors, which they hated and which had been ongoing despite American protests. The second was French Republicans were more allied with the Americans than the British were. Basically, America was less willing to go to war with France than it was with England. And third and finally, the landmass of Canada, always to the north and always controlled by the British, was a tempting prize for the American colonists. However, Federalists were opposed to the war for two reasons. The first was that they liked Britain better. Obviously, they saw Britain as their key trading partner. And the second was that Canada, if Canada was conquered, it would only offer agricultural benefits. And remember that the Federalists are mostly merchants, bankers. They don't really care about farming as much. However, in brief, America's reasons for entering the war in 1812 were pretty simple. The first was the freedom of the seas. The U.S. wanted the right to sail and trade without fear, either without fear of impressment or without fear of British attacks against their trading vessels. The second was the possibility of land. The U.S. wanted to gain Canada or even Florida to the south. And the third was issues with the Native Americans. The Americans were still upset about British guns being sold to the Indians and then being used against the American colonists. The nation became sectionalized. Generally, the North was against the war since it's more Federalist, and the West and South were for the war. Thus, a disunited America had to fight both Old England and New England in the War of 1812, since Britain was the enemy while New England tried everything they could to frustrate American ambitions in the war and return to peace with Great Britain.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
Comment if you have any questions, and we'll catch you guys next time.